By 2 a.m. in the Waco battle, as the mixed American forces from Fort Hood described in the previous installation of this subseries of the invasion documentary had made it into the Waco battle space from the Fort Hood battle space, as they had been harried and harassed on their way out by the J-11 fighters and their FH-97A accompanying stealth fighter drones, as well as loitering munitions in the form of the Russian Lancet 3s and Chinese CH-901As, and also artillery from both the Russian and Chinese forces in the Fort Hood area. Many of these mixed American elements had tried to make contact with the 143rd Infantry Regiment, which was a light airborne infantry force, as they were fully aware that they were within the Waco battle space and had sought to make contact with them. As only a very limited number of these mixed American forces had actually made it into downtown, the rest had been caught up in the southwestern portions of Waco and were thus being destroyed, although one had made it into the southeastern quadrant of the Waco battle space, and by 2 a.m. was being attacked and surrounded and destroyed by the Combat Engineer Battalion within the 8th Independent Brigade of the PLA's 68th Group Army, which was responsible for both the actions occurring in the Fort Hood battle space as well as those within the Waco battle space and even a bit beyond, as a subunit of the 288th Light Infantry Division, being the 13th Light Armored Brigade, had spaced out its comprising battalions in a crescent shape outside of the Waco battle space, with two of its light tank battalions just to the south along I-35 between the Fort Hood battle space and Waco battle space, with only its artillery battalion within the Waco battle space itself, providing fire support to not only the forces in the Waco battle, but also beyond, as there are other battalions that had been spaced out outside of the Waco area were engaging armed reactionary civilian forces as they sought to seek total, complete control just beyond the 15 by 15 mile battle space that was the Waco battlefield. As the mixed American forces that were being engaged by the 8th Independent Brigade's combat engineer battalions, including even an armed reactionary militia force that was comprised of militia-type elements of the American civilian population, which was a direct result of these forces coming together in response to the failed border policies which were assisting the Trojan shock forces component of fourth generation warfare within the American nation, as this aided them with troop rotations and even further deployments just prior to the invasion, with many American civilian elements coming together and comprising their own militias in response to the deteriorated security situation within the country just before the fourth generation warfare doctrine invasion had kicked off. As the fighting was picking up and hitting a fever pitch in downtown, including with other forces within the 8th Independent Brigade, as well as also even the 38th Infantry Brigade and other elements of the 288th Light Infantry Division, the two armored battalions belonging to the 8th Independent Brigade had sliced through and raced into the downtown area to begin to clash with the 143rd Infantry Regiment, as well as armed reactionary civilian forces that were not only in the downtown area, but were also just outside of downtown, but still within Waco proper, as the other mechanized infantry battalion within the 8th Independent Brigade, besides the additional one they had within the Robinson area, surrounding and destroying armed reactionary civilians early on in the invasion before moving to seize control of the southern entrance to I-35 from Waco. The fighting in downtown was hitting a fever pitch as the armored battalions, including their tank companies, which 4 of which comprised each battalion, as well as the 2 armored infantry companies within each battalion, and even the anti-tank companies within each battalion, with each battalion having one of them, and the headquarters battalion, responsible for logistics and command over each battalion, were now running into the initial beginnings of a defense line that was beginning to form in the downtown area, comprised of rubbled fighting positions and also barricades that would begin to be pushed in place as the many abandoned civilian vehicles, much like in the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma battle, would be pushed out into the streets along with rubble as a mixed American force, which included combat engineers with their M1150 armored engineering vehicles, would assist in blocking the streets with both rubble and abandoned or destroyed civilian vehicles, making it exceedingly difficult for easy passage of the PLA forces, who were to be joined in short time by Russian forces consisting of 2 battalions from the 16th Tank Division of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, 1 armored infantry battalion, which was essentially a mechanized infantry force, as well as 1 of the armored battalions, which was essentially their tanks as well as some more armored infantry, as they also had a few companies of those, and an anti-tank company and headquarters company, similar to the PLA forces and their composition as it pertained to their armored battalions. As the fighting in downtown was already well underway, as American forces tried to fight back against a force that had superior ISR capabilities, including at the most local of levels with their quadcopter reconnaissance assets, also even loitering munitions, and even armed combat drones. These forces would give it their all as it pertained to the American forces present in the fighting, and would put up their best fight. As it pertained to the fighting going on in the Robinson area between the armed reactionary civilian militia, who had their own fortified compound comprised of earthwork walls around their compound, which essentially were earthen berms that they had constructed, as well as also even planting certain devices at their main gate, which, although this early on in the fighting was rare, it was not completely unheard of, as there were certain Americans that had certain skills and could make certain implements, and including these devices. Although, due to the fact that they were not exceedingly well camouflaged, the PLA's ISR would be able to spot them through their IR or night vision imaging from the quadcopter reconnaissance assets, as well as their armed and unarmed robotics, which were the quad-legged robots with the W-85 heavy machine guns and a camera system for aiming them, as well as their unarmed demolition robots, which could plant or remove certain devices or essentially demolition charges, and they could remove them as well, and also assist with the removing of obstacles like concertina wire and more. Although in this particular instance at this fight that now occurred, as the mixed American units that had moved under I-35 before PLA forces had entered the area to seize control of this route had, instead of moving directly to the north towards downtown, had instead moved to the east, as they were fully aware, having been chased out of the Fort Hood battle space by the enemy aircraft, artillery, and loitering munitions, that they needed to recon the area as well as possible to figure out what the safest route would be to even be able to make contact with the 143rd. Instead of taking the most direct route, they had taken a different route and were in the area trying to essentially figure out where all enemies were, and they had to do this with the most primitive means possible by dispatching some of their comprising elements, as these were a mixed force, to recon areas around them, which made their movement exceedingly slow, as well as the lack of communications, as mentioned in previous video installments, and also enemy activity. Going to the map of this particular battle space, within Robinson, as this was in the outskirts of Robinson, within a mixed suburban and semi-rural area, there were two housing developments in this particular battle space. There was one in the southwest of the map, and another across a creek in the northeast of this particular battle map, beyond a thick wooded and hilly area with steep elevation, as the geographic features in this particular part of Texas, as this was on the outer boundaries of what was called the hill country, was hilly indeed, and was also full of wooded areas as well, especially in the eastern segments of Waco. As the forces were moving into the area of the PLA, as their ISR assets, both their high-altitude CH-4A orbiting this particular segment of the battle space, as well as also their quadcopter reconnaissance assets, which was available to each and every vehicle and squad within each vehicle, as the vehicle and the squad were essentially one as it pertained to the dismounts and the vehicle, as well as the platoon level and up, going all the way to the high-altitude reconnaissance assets, whether they were high-altitude recon drones, spy planes, and then even beyond to the satellite level, all interlinked all the way down to the most local of levels to map the battlefield in real time and send the data back to the forces in the field through their combat data links, as the AI system had processed all the real-time data, which included everything from windage to the weapon systems and their capabilities in order to best deploy these systems without friendly fire casualties, which cut these down to essentially almost zero, and also the angle and traverse of weapon systems to make their usage more safe and also more destructive to the enemy. There would be 3 PLA combat engineer companies within the combat engineer battalion moving south before hooking around essentially what was almost 3 American companies who had moved into a farm area, as this was a fence line that wrapped around this property, as this was a sort of ranch property, and there were 2 barns, 2 silos. There was the farmhouse that were adjacent to this housing development, whereby the roads went to the south and southeast. And these forces of American mixed units had essentially, these 3 company-sized elements, moved into this area, which actually was very close to the American militia forces compound that was in this particular area, with its earthen berms that were topped with concertina and barbed wire fencing. This was a very well fortified installation as it related to these militia forces, and would be stormed by the combat engineers and destroyed, as they would have heavy support from the CH-901A loitering munitions fired by the close by headquarters battalion and its dedicated drone section for combat drones, such as these loitering munitions, firing them into this particular area. With 32 of these kamikaze loitering munitions set on their AI targeting mode and armed with heat warheads, as it was anticipated that they would be needed to use with the heat warheads to destroy some of the more heavily armed vehicles of this grouping of mixed American forces, such as the Bradleys and also even the Stryker Dragoons. Although they were less armored than the Bradleys, they were still relatively formidable and had a 30-millimeter autocannon, similar to many of the PLA's infantry fighting vehicles, which was a very powerful weapon indeed. And the other vehicles included a few armored engineering vehicles. Although there were no Abrams tanks, there were some Bradleys again, and also the Stryker Dragoons and the M1150 armored engineering vehicles. Although not seen on this particular battle map, they were just to the south of these forces off the map in this farming area, which these roads had wrapped around from the housing development, with a road leading out of it and linking with this farm road right here, as they're called in Texas, these rural routes. And there was another route that left out of this housing development over in this wooded area. And the mixed American forces present would be sending essentially a platoon's worth of their forces out of this area. And by this point in time, at the opening of this map, they were headed through this hilly wooded terrain, up this farm road and into this housing development right here, as this platoon element had dispatched their squads to patrol the wooded areas that were adjacent to this road that led into this housing development. And at the opening of this map, there were many other actions going on, as this is actually 10 minutes into the overall fighting that was occurring, as some skirmishes leading into this battle had taken place as PLA combat engineer companies were moving into the area near this particular property. It was a farm property that was converted into a militia base. There were two improvised devices by the gate, although these were seen as they were not well camouflaged, utilizing their ISR assets. Although it was, again, early on in the invasion, and it was rare that there were such devices throughout the land. It was not completely unheard of. And the forces in the Waco area included personnel that had essentially expertise in this area, which would end up even helping them acquire some of the PLA's infantry forces' weapons, as they would manage to eliminate a squad in another portion of the battle space and acquire some of their weapon systems, such as their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades and a few light machine guns, and also some of the rifles, before other PLA forces managed to get to the fallen squad, pull security around them, and essentially basically tend to their fallen. As it pertained to the cruise missiles flying in the map at the opening of the map, these were supersonic either calibers or YJ-18Cs fired from the Club K systems, which were the Russian-based container disguise systems, which were all throughout the land, or the Chinese YJ-18C systems that were equal to the Club Ks, essentially, as these also were container-based disguised cruise missile systems, which between the Russian and Chinese-made systems totaled 10,000 of the systems, which each could carry 4 missiles apiece, which added up to 40,000 of these container-based cruise missiles that were located throughout the land and had preset targets for the first volleys of these systems, which were timed to go off at different times as it pertained to these container-based systems. And they would fire in volleys all the way up until the last ones had been fired at 10 a.m. on day one, from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. As the volleys were done so that follow-up volleys could have their targeting data changed if necessary, and also for the psychological impact of keeping these systems flying as long as possible to keep the enemy guessing on what would be hit next, and keeping the missiles airborne as a psychological factor. Although the primary factor, again, was to change the targeting data if needed, as targets would likely change and could be updated as the battle dragged on. As the forces on this particular map had already entered after limited skirmishes, the Combat Engineer Battalion, made up of its 7 combat engineer companies, as well as its headquarters and support company. The headquarters and support company with a combat company of combat engineers would remain off the map and just to the north of this battle space, which again was 2 miles east to west and 1 mile north to south. As a company had already moved into the area, as this again was 10 minutes into the battle, and had lined themselves up for a flank guarding operation as the other forces moved into the map, as well as was done with this company here with its combat platoons here, and also even here across this farm road, and also across from this housing development. As one platoon had been dismounted from this platoon here, as they had a squad here, one here moving over this fence and breaking up into 2 squads of 5 apiece going around this house, and also 2 half squads here between these 2 homes and their side yards, between these 2 garages and driveways that fed out into the road. Also this half squad and this half squad, and again a full squad. As they had done so to guard their flanks for these forces, 3 entire companies of combat engineers were moving single file as far as their combat elements, with their headquarters elements off the map for each company, their headquarters platoons, moving through this area, through this housing development, to wrap around other American forces just off the map of these roughly 3 company-sized elements that were present at this particular battle. As the combat engineers would essentially get 2 birds for 1 stone as it pertained to eliminating the American forces of their mixed military elements present, as this was essentially a company's worth of combat elements, as there was a platoon worth here, a platoon worth here, and a platoon worth here of combat vehicles. And there was a headquarters-like element of mixed headquarters vehicles in this particular area here, with an M113 with a M250 cal as part of this element to protect it, as well as these Max Pro MRAPs that had LMTV trucks, a fuel truck, and a M88 recovery vehicle, which was an armored recovery vehicle which could recover damaged or destroyed vehicles. And there was another platoon-like element, which was essentially like a headquarters platoon force of mixed elements, moving in off the map into this area, which would be destroyed with the rest of the American forces. And again, there were 32 of 48 fired loitering munitions, as the other loitering munitions of that volley were attending to other combat matters elsewhere besides the combat engineer forces, although 32 loitering munitions would be an ample strike element to support the forces in the field. And although the combat engineers would suffer some minimal losses in this particular battle, they would prevail, and the American losses would be far heavier, as was a common trend in the opening invasion. Although over time, thousands of PLA troops and others would be lost fighting against American partisan elements as they acquired better weaponry and better tactics and training and experience over the years. Although still, American casualties would be a monstrosity. They would be heinous and would be far, far higher than anything the PLA and their allies would ever lose, because the PLA and their allies were professional military forces with high degrees of technology and capabilities and doctrinal and tactical superiority, and ISR superiority, and again, weapons superiority, which would end up causing the Americans to lose millions upon millions over the course of the entire war, eventually taking the population all the way down to 40 million from its previous 340 million over the course of the insurgency. As the PLA troops operating in this area were moving through, including this company, and these being the combat elements of the headquarters platoon off map, and this company, its combat elements having already moved into the point where these vehicles are at the opening of this map, having fought militia elements just to the north of their compound, they had also moved into the area and had now already destroyed the sandbag emplacement with militia elements protecting the driveway leading into the farm, which had been fortified, as the militia leader had bought this farm and turned it into a compound, a fortified compound, with this being the farmhouse here, a guest house here where militia elements of their troops would rotate through this facility to guard it, and when they did, they would stay at the guest house where they would rotate on guard duty in shifts. As again, this militia force was quasi-professional, and they also had a shed where they had logistical elements such as their quartermaster, who maintained the ammunition, the MREs, the water that had all been stockpiled over the years into the shed. They also had a prefab metal building where they kept some of their technicals inside that they had welded armor plating on, similar to what the Mexicans had done as it pertained to some of their gangs down south across the border with trucks. As these technicals would be slammed into by loitering munitions and heavy fire from the combat engineers, including from each platoon's infantry fighting vehicles, EBD-04A, these would be easily destroyed against such heavy firepower, although they would still attempt to put up a fight, but would definitely not prevail against the loitering munitions, the armed robots, the quad-legged robots with their W-85 heavy machine guns, the armored engineering vehicle GCZ-112, which could fire a rocket-fired line charge, which could demolish with C4 a massive area, including various fortifications and traps such as anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, essentially a minefield, or improvised devices, as well as other fortifications. And also the heavy machine gun turret-based Type 89A armor personnel carriers, as each platoon had 3 of them, and in place of the 4th one, instead they had their armored engineering vehicle. The combat engineers, more or less, were like, in a sense, in a matter of speaking, essentially like an elite infantry force, as they were equipped in a very similar manner to mechanized infantry, although in place of a 4th armor personnel carrier, they had a armored engineering vehicle and essentially were the go-to force for assaulting heavily defended areas, as they could essentially overcome fortifications. They were a sapper-like force. They were essentially almost like elite infantry in that way, as they had not just combat infantry skills, they also possessed engineering capabilities, whether it came to laying out fortifications and traps or demolishing and destroying them. These were the perfect force for assaulting such a heavily defended area. Essentially, as all the loitering munitions moved into the area and hovered over it looking for targets on their AI target-seeking mode, as the parameters were set according to the warhead type and enemy type that could be encountered in the field, these would exact a heavy toll on the mixed American military forces present and even the militia forces present within their compound, as they would lose many of their technicals to these loitering munitions operating in the area. As the combat engineers guarding the flanks had dismounted a platoon in the south along this steep hill right here, this wooded steep hill overlooking these two farm roads, as well as dismounting a platoon in the north along the company's combat elements line with their platoon element behind them, their platoon of headquarters elements, I should say. The forces in this particular area were beginning to move in across the creek, and at the opening of this map, they were in these positions here. There were also American militia elements from this compound operating in this area over here, with one of their technicals having essentially driven around their compound and down this hill that it sat upon onto this farm road before turning and taking these roads into this area here before moving up here at the opening of the map, as combat had already again broken out, with skirmishes occurring as these forces were moving into the area of this company of combat engineers, as they were assaulting the militia compound head on, and would surround it with two additional platoons along with their forward attacking platoon and hit it on multiple sides, even demolishing segments of its walls to make it easier to penetrate if need be for the soon-to-be dismounted forces. As other forces of the militia element had fled down the driveway to this road and made it here, including a technical here, even dismounted forces of theirs, some being ex-military, some were just the forces that were trained up that wanted to join the militia, using their tactical formations, including a double column, a wedge formation, and even a staggered column formation, moving through into this area at this time, along with this technical of theirs. As these forces were moving down the road with their lead elements already in the housing area, these armed civilians, these were armed civilians that were not part of the militia forces, but were coming out of the homes in this area, which would be quickly eliminated not only by the leading platoon, but also of the dismounted forces from this platoon, from this other company that was holding this area as a flank protection operation, as these forces moved down the road to surround and destroy these American forces that were sitting on the farm and immediately adjacent to it. As they moved down the road, their follow-up elements of the other companies, as there were 3 combat engineer companies' combat elements moving down this road, would destroy these forces of militia moving through this particular area, as they would completely annihilate their technical with 30 millimeter autocannon ammunition, as well as also 100 millimeter shells that would annihilate the infantry elements of the militia-like forces as well. And although the mixed American elements got in a good shot with one of their tow missile systems that was mounted on the Bradley on the turret within one of the 2 tow pods, destroying a combat engineer vehicle, a Type 89A armor personnel carrier, and eliminating not just the driver and gunner, but the entire dismounted squad that was inside and mounted up in the vehicle. They were mounted in it and had not been dismounted, although they were dismounts when they dismounted. They were mounted up in this vehicle at the time. And the tow had hit and destroyed this vehicle, with the infantry fighting vehicle firing back while this had been occurring, as well as the heavy machine guns firing into these forces, as well as the loitering munitions finally entering and slamming into all these combat vehicles that formed this company-sized element of mixed American vehicles, as these CH-901As with their heat warheads completely annihilated all these vehicles as they moved through this area. And the encapsulated green arrow in red indicates this, as they had already been taking fire by the point of the opening of this map, as indicated, as they're right here at the opening of this particular map battle. And you can see the red around the vehicles. That's the fire they were taking from the W-85 heavy machine guns, as well as also the fire that was beginning to come in from the 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter autocannon, 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine gun fire, all coming from the ZBD-04A, which destroyed these vehicles as they were moving into the area, with loitering munitions slamming into them as well. As in total, there were 17 loitering munitions that were right here, which was more than enough to destroy all of these 20 vehicles, along with the fire coming from the infantry fighting vehicle that began to hit them as they were moving through these thinly wooded areas moving up here. They were seen through the optics and imaging of the ZBD-04A and were thus destroyed. As these dismounted squads from this element right here of these mixed American forces that were essentially a company-sized element of the basically what was essentially 3 company-sized elements in this area of mixed American forces, with more off the map. They had dismounted these 2 squads in these wedge formations to check and recon this housing development, similar to what was occurring over here, with these 2 wedge formations here and here, moving through this thickly wooded area, having been dismounted further back before these combat engineers had turned and entered into this area, including these 2 squads as well. As these loitering munitions moved into the area, along with vehicle-based fire, firing down at these vehicles, and also anti-tank missiles in the form of HJ-08 man-portable anti-tank missile systems being fired by these dismounted combat engineers. These 2 vehicles have been completely and totally destroyed even before the loitering munitions got to them. They were sitting here smoking in the road, while these 2 had escaped behind the steeply hilled terrain, which made it difficult for the vehicles and the troops to actually fire upon them, as they had moved behind this steeply hilled area here, and they had moved into this neighborhood and had turned around and faced this way. But the loitering munitions entering this area would strike and destroy them. As, again, so many things are occurring on the map at the same exact time, as this was a large area with many different occurrences happening all at once. As the fighting at the opening of the map here had already been occurring, with these 2 dismounted American squads moving into the area, being fired at by the vehicle-based and dismounted fire as they were on top of this hill, and the quadcopter reconnaissance assets knew not only where they were, but also where these vehicles were, and they could see these personnel moving out of the woods and into this housing development as the 2 wedge formations worth of a squad apiece moved between these homes and stopped temporarily. They then bounded across the street, with them bounding first and them bounding second, with them moving around this house and facing this way, with this squad here moving between the properties into the backyards of these 2 homes and facing this way. The other squads were at the opening of this map, moving through this area, including this double column formation within the woods, moving here, while they had a line formation exchanging fire with these forces over here. At the opening of this map, there's already 3 KIAs, as indicated by this man on the end and these 2 on this end, that are completely encapsulated in red, with these 2 combat medics running up this hill and into this woods to tend to the wounded, as there's a wounded man as well, besides the KIAs. And although they're taking fire, this squad is bounded forward as this one's moving into the area, with this dismounted wedge formation squad getting on the top of this hilly terrain in this thickly wooded area, with combat again resembling this, as the American troops had been fighting and firing back, exchanging fire with PLA troops that were firing at them with 35 millimeter grenades, Type 69 rocket-propelled anti-personnel rounds from their Type 69 Chinese RPGs, as well as their small arms fire from their light machine guns and rifles, firing at the Americans who were returning fire at them. And also there was the vehicle-based fire, troops down in the prone position in this thickly wooded area, as these vehicles had plowed their way through the woods, as shown, and were firing back at them, which had ended up eliminating all of them, as this encapsulated green arrow in the red indicates, along with these troops who had moved in this way being hit by the side, just as this wedge formation was firing upon them, along with the vehicle-based fire. It was an L-shaped vector of fire, as fire came from this way and from this way, which completely wiped them out, with the aid of their quadcopter ISR assets helping them to orient their fire and make it as precise as possible. As this squad on the end had moved through this wooded area and crossed this little grassy area right here before seizing control of the road here, they had opened fire at the opening of this map as this vehicle was getting to this point here of this technical that had gone around this road here and up here. And at the opening of this map, as they moved into position, they opened fire on these patrolling militia elements that were on foot, as well as also this vehicle right here. And they had fired one of their HJ-08s at this vehicle and completely destroyed it and everybody inside of it in this technical. And it also opened heavy fire on these dismounted personnel on this hilly wooded terrain across this farm road right there. While these squads, these 3 in the middle, besides these 2 on the ends, were moving in to begin to seize control of this neighborhood and this area right here in this cul-de-sac, as this staggered formation of essentially 2 columns, a staggered formation, moved in through the back of this house here, kicking in the door and running through and clearing it. They had split up into two stack team elements of 5 men apiece, 2 half squads, with one going in through the garage and clearing the house here, another going in to this house right here. After clearing it, this half squad runs and clears this house, while they both rendezvous and form a full squad again in this house right here, watching this farm road right there, while this other squad watches the end of it up here, as they were seizing control of the entry and exit points from the north to the south in this particular area, while these 2 other squads moved into position here and guarded the outside of this home as it was being cleared by the half squad before the half squad moved into this home here. This squad took position outside the home before then finally bounding into this area right here, while this other squad held their position right here to hold the end of the neighborhood right up here. As they moved into position here, they had begun exchanging fire with this squad that was right here. They had begun exchanging fire. And although they had lost a soldier, they had KIA'd this entire squad, again with the help of the ISR assets, causing this squad to move up into the area and begin exchanging fire with them. But they had all been KIA'd as well due to assistance with ISR assets and the PLA troops using some of their heavy weapons they had available. And they had wiped out those forces and now held control over the entire neighborhood over in this particular area of the battlefield across this bridge that spanned this creek right here. As all of this was going on in this particular area, the fighting over in these other areas had already at the opening of the map caused these militia forces to be KIA'd right here. As these others had moved in, they had been KIA'd, as mentioned before, by the vehicle-based fire. With these armed reactionary civilians leaving these homes that weren't militia being KIA'd by the dismounts firing in between the homes or through the homes with their weapons, as these homes were built out of wood and other soft materials and could easily be fired through by the small arms available to the PLA troops, wiping out these armed reactionary civilians along with fire coming from their vehicles passing through the area early on. As these had escaped barely with their lives, these 4 personnel right here, as they were being fired at through these homes and by these dismounted elements, they had just barely made it through this wooded area alive. With these personnel, this one on the very end here being KIA'd and these 2 being KIA'd, with these other 2 making it out with their lives. And they were essentially left alone by the PLA, although they could have pursued and wiped them out. The PLA was far more concerned with eliminating the mixed American forces, which had been essentially achieved with the combination of this company's combat elements moving through the area, with the lead platoon reorienting their vehicles facing this way, firing this way, with the vehicles orienting their turrets facing this way and firing into these forces this way, with the loitering munition strikes having wiped out a fair number of the vehicles along this fence line, with the dismounted troops being wiped out with ease by the vehicle-based fire, along with the dismounted squads, as indicated by these tiny arrows, leaving the vehicles and assisting and providing mutual support with the vehicles while firing on these forces here and completely wiping them out, as the forces up here had also destroyed these vehicles as well as loitering munitions in the form of 17 of them, hitting 17 of these vehicles with the vehicle-based fire, destroying the last 3 of these combat vehicles. And over here, this neighborhood had been completely controlled by the PLA troops, with these militia forces over here and here being destroyed as these vehicles are passing through the area of these 3 companies of combat engineers moving through to surround the mixed American elements in this farm and just outside of it before destroying the rest of them off the map with the assistance of this company here. The headquarters company over the entire battalion and one of the combat engineer companies was off the map to the north in Robinson, as the headquarters company over the entire battalion was commanding the operation, with one of the 7 combat companies of combat engineers providing them security while the other companies were operating in this area. As early on, this sandbag emplacement had been wiped out by vehicle-based fire, as well as these militia personnel taking cover by their driveway, and also on this side of the street with loitering munitions and vehicle-based fire shredding them all up. This vehicle had moved here to block this area of this street in and out, while this vehicle moved in to provide support in this area, while the heavy machine gun equipped armed robots were firing into the compound here and here as well, moving up on top of the fortifications after this armored engineering vehicle fired its rocket based line charge of C4 and demolished not only the main gate but also the improvised devices that were spotted by the gate, and destroyed the shed and also technicals and many of the personnel. As that was going on early on, these vehicles moved here after destroying the sandbag emplacement with the armed robots on this side, laying down heavy fire on personnel that were trying to fire up and over this berm that weren't KIA'd by this humongous line charge of C4. With this platoon moving into place here with their vehicles spaced out, with this one right here, and they sent their demolition robot right there between these arrows up to the berm, planting a charge in the berm itself after climbing up a bit on it and climbing back down and getting behind the safety of the vehicles of this platoon here, the inner one that lined up and spaced out here. And they demolished a large segment of their fortifications with their C4 charges, with these two squads dismounting and moving into the now demolished area, firing in at these forces here and here, while the other three squads dismounted to guard their flanks, as this platoon of combat engineers has now moved through the area here, spacing out their vehicles and sending one of their robots, which successfully planted the charge, as had the other one done. And as they moved back, they had taken heavy fire and destroyed the robot. As the robot had been destroyed, the command detonation, controlled by the troops, demolished this segment of the wall. Now their last vehicle could fire into this area right here, which KIA'd many of the troops that were manning it, along with the C4 charge. Whatever the C4 charge didn't get, the last vehicle did with its turret-based machine gun. With these squads being dismounted, with the lead squad taking position outside here, returning fire with some on the parapets of this berm, as well as this vehicle and troops having been destroyed by the lead infantry fighting vehicle, blasting them as they were coming around the corner. The lead squad was now firing at these from the infantry fighting vehicles, firing at those on the tops of the berm, with these other squads moving up the berm and firing down in, with the last vehicle firing in, and these two squads taking position outside. Eventually, after all the destruction, including with the loitering munitions hitting some of the technicals, especially these here, one here and one here, after they destroyed the technicals, including a line charge which demolished the shed with the supplies, these technicals and troops by the gate, and the improvised devices, the bots firing down in, the squads firing down in, vehicles firing in, eventually led to this place being completely wiped out, with some prisoners being taken that had surrendered, that were not KIA'd between these barns and around the farmhouse right here on the other side of it, and between the barns, as these squads then from the top had moved in and begun to clear the guest house and the farmhouse as shown by these arrows, and they had captured the rest of these troops. And that ended the battle in this particular area, this 2 by 1 mile area of the battle space, with the combat engineers fighting the mixed American military units and the militia elements at their compound and just outside of it. As this battle had come to an end, the next battle in Waco would be the fighting that occurred between another combat engineer battalion, which had one of its platoons helping with this kill box, in the Waco area just to the south of downtown. That will be gone over in the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series of fourth generation warfare in the Waco battle.